It's 3 o'clock on Saturday, so we're going to continue our journey reading Hinds' Feet on High Places. And I did the same thing this week that I did last week, where I didn't read it before. So we'll see the reactions that we all have. So if you're on Facebook or either on YouTube, there's also a chat function that you can always click and ask me a question or just say hello or anything you want. So I'm going to start chapter 9, and the name of it is The Great Precipice Injury. So it seems like Much Afraid's journey so far has been up and down and up and down, and her emotions have been up and down, haven't they? But she's learning through these things to walk on a more peaceful path, I think. I hope. Let's see. So chapter 9, Great Precipice of Injury. So we left Much Afraid in chapter 8, where she went through some hard times, and he caught the shepherd's hand as he had come when she called out to him, and she thought, oh, now we're going to go to the high places finally, you and I, shepherd. So we'll see what happens here. So for a little while, Much Afraid had a song in her heart as she walked along the fields and orchards and the low hills of the country to which they had come. It hardly seemed to matter now. Sorrow and suffering were still with her because of the hope leaping up in her heart that soon they would cease to be her companions altogether. For when she came to the mountains again, and they had helped her up to the places, she would need them no longer, she thought. Neither did it matter that the path they followed still southward, twisting among the hills and leading through quiet valleys, because she had the shepherd's own promise. Soon it would lead her back to the eastern mountains and to the place of her heart's desire. So her heart's desire is a place, when her heart's desire is standing right in front of her sometimes, the shepherd. So after a time, the path began sloping toward the summits of the hills. One day, they suddenly reached the top of the highest of the hills, and just as the sun rose, found themselves plateau. They looked eastward toward the golden sunrise, and might burst into a cry of joy and thankfulness. There, at no distance, on the far end of the plateau, quite distinct and rising like a great wall, crowned with ramparts and towers and pinnacles, all of which were glowing rose red and gold in sunrise. Never thought she had seen anything so beautiful. As the sun rose higher and the glow faded from the sky, she saw that the highest peaks were covered with snow, so white and glittering that her eyes were dazzled with their glory. She was looking at the high places themselves. Best of all, the path they were following here turns eastward and led directly toward the mountains. Much Afraid fell on her knees on the hilltop, bowed her head, and worshipped. It seemed to her at that moment that all the pain and all the postponement, all the sorrows and trials of the long journey she had made were as nothing compared to the glory which shone before her. It seemed to her, too, that even her companions were smiling with her. When she had worshipped and rejoiced, she rose to her feet, and all three started to cross the plateau. It was amazing how quick they went, for the path was flat, comparatively smooth, and before they could have believed it possible, they found themselves approaching the mountains, among the slopes and boulders at their very feet. As they approached, Much Afraid could not help being struck by the steepness of these slopes. The nearer they drew, the more like impassable walls the mountains have to become. But she told herself that when she was right up them, they would find a valley or a gorge or a pass up which they proceed, and that certainly would not mind how steep the way was, if only led upward. In the late afternoon, they did come to the top lower slopes and to the very foot of the mountains. The path they were following led them right up to the foot of a passable precipice, and it stopped them dead. Much afraid stood still and stared. The more she looked, the more stunned she felt. Began to tremble and shake all over, for the whole mountain range before her, as far as she could see, right or to the left, rose up in unbroken walls of rock so high that it made her giddy when she put her head back and tried to look up to the top. The cliffs completely blocked the way before her. Yet the path ran right up to them, stopped. There was no sign of a track in any other direction, and there was no way at all by which the overhanging, terrifying wall of cliff could be ascended. They would have to turn back. Wow, have to turn back. So what was Much Afraid's reaction to the promise she had been by the shepherd when she saw this impassable path now? She hoped, I wrote down, she hoped that she wouldn't have sorrow and suffering with her anymore. And so she hoped that she could do that, but then all of a sudden they can't go any further. So now she realizes she needs sorrow and suffering with her. She needs those companions that he chose for her. And when she saw the path stop, she just stopped and trembled. She was in shock and amazement. And she couldn't believe that there was no way to go because the shepherd had promised her. So she had all these conflicting thoughts and feelings. So just as this overwhelming realization came to her, suffering caught her hand and pointed to the rocky walls. A hart, followed by a hind, had appeared from them among the jumbled rocks around them and were now actually beginning to ascend the precipice. As the three watching, Much Afraid turned dizzy and faint, for she saw that the hart, which was leading the way, was following what appeared to be a narrow and intensely steep track which went zigzagging across the face of the cliff. In some parts it was only a narrow ledge. In others there appeared to be rough steps, but in certain places she saw that the track apparently broke right off. Then the hart would leap across that gap and go springing upwards, always followed by the hind, who set her feet exactly where his had been, and leaped after him as lightly, as sure-footed, and apparently unafraid as it was possible for any creature to be. So the two of them leaped and sprang with perfect grace and assurance up the face of the precipice and disappeared from sight over the top. Much Afraid covered her face with her hands and sank down on a rock with a horror and dread in her heart, such as she had never felt before. Then she felt her two companions take her hands in theirs and heard them say, "Do not be afraid, Much Afraid. This is not a dead end after all, and we shall not have to turn back. There is a way up the face of the precipice. The hart and the hind have shown us quite plainly. We shall be able to follow it too and make the ascent." "Oh, no, no," Much Afraid almost shrieked. "That path is utterly impossible. The deer may be able to manage it, but no human being could. I could never get up there. I would fall headlong and be broken in pieces on those awful rocks. She burst into hysterical sobbing. It's an impossibility, an absolute impossibility. I cannot get to the high places that way, and so can never get there at all. Look, she's giving the whole thing up. Her two guides tried to say something more, but she put her hands over her ears. La, 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 la. And she sobbed, terrified. There was the shepherd's much afraid, sitting at the foot of the precipice, wringing her hands and shaking with terror, sobbing over and over, I can't do it. I can't. I shall never get to the high place. Nothing less like royalty could be imagined, but far worse was to follow. As she crouched on the ground, completely exhausted, heard a crunching sound and a rattling of loose stones, and then a voice close beside her. Ha ha, my dear little cousin, we meet again at last. How do you find yourself now, much afraid, in this delightfully pleasant situation? She opened her eyes in fresh terror and found herself looking right into the hideous face of Craven Fear himself. That's who her family wanted her to marry. I thought somehow, he went on with a look of the most horrible gloating. Yes, I really thought that we could come together again at last. Did you really believe, you poor little fool, that you could escape from me altogether? No, much afraid. You are one of the Fearings, and you can't evade the truth. And what is more, you trembling little idiot, you belong to me. I have come to take you back safely and make sure that you don't wander off again. I won't go with you, gasped Afraid, too shocked by this awful apparition to have her wits about her. I absolutely refuse to go with you. Well, you can take your choice, sneered Craven. Take a look at the precipice before you, my dear cousin. Won't you feel lovely up there? Just look where I'm pointing, much afraid. See there, halfway up, where that dizzy little ledge breaks right off, and you have to jump across the chasm onto that bit of rock? Just picture yourself jumping that, much afraid, and finding yourself hanging over space, clutching a bit of slippery rock which you can't hold onto another minute. He was painting this picture for her, you know. Just imagine those ugly knife-like rocks at the of the precipice, waiting to receive and mangle you to pieces as your strength is out and you plunge down on them. Doesn't it give you a lovely feeling, much afraid? Just take time to picture it in your mind. That's only one of many such broken places on the track. And the higher you go, you dear little fool, the farther you will have to fall. Well, take your choice. Either you must up there where you know you can't, but will end up in a mangled heap at the bottom, or you must come back and live with me and be my little slave forever. Ugh. And the rocks and the cliffs, they seemed to echo what he was saying and gloating. Much afraid, said the two guides, stooping over her and shaking her by the shoulder firmly. Much afraid, you know where your help lies. Call for help. That's going to be the shepherd. She clung to them and sighed. I'm afraid to call, she gasped. I'm so afraid that if I call him, he will tell me that I must go that way, that dreadful, dreadful way, and I can't. It's impossible. I can't face it. Oh, what shall I do? Whatever shall I do? Boy, that reminds me of myself at times. I can't face this. I can't face this. Lord. So Sorrow, her companion, bent over her and said very gently, but urgently, you must call for him. Much afraid, call at once. Wow. So she was hysterical, was believing and picturing those things that Craven Fear was telling her. and she had it in her mind now, okay, this is the way it's going to be. That's totally made up. It's totally from someone's mind. It's not the truth. The things we worry about very seldom happen. So she responded in hysteria. And what door did Much Afraid open to the enemy by believing the lies? The door wide open for the attack for craven fear. So fear is her enemy, and she opened the door to it by responding in hysterics. So continuing, she says, if I call on the shepherd, shuddered Much Afraid through chattering teeth, he will tell me to build an altar, and I can't. This time, I can't. Craven Fear laughed triumphantly and took a step toward her, but her two companions selves between him and his victim. Then Suffering looked at Sorrow, who nodded back. In an answer to the nod, Suffering took a small but very sharp knife which hung at her girdle, and bending over the crouching figure, Much Afraid, pricked her. Much Afraid cried out in anguish, and then in utter despair at finding herself helpless in the presence of all three, did that which she ought to have done the moment the path brought them to the foot of the precipice. Though now she felt too ashamed to do it, she did so because she was forced by her extreme situation. She cried out, "Oh Lord, I'm oppressed. Undertake for me. My fears have taken a hold of me, and I am ashamed to look up." Why Much Afraid? It was the shepherd's voice close beside her. "What is the matter? Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid." He sounded so cheery and full of strength, and moreover, without a hint of reproach. See, isn't that just beautiful? No reproach. Wow. Wow. He's got that anointed forgiver that he gives us because he forgets. He forgives us and then he forgets it. He's always bring cheer to her. Much Afraid felt as though a strong and exhilarating cordial had been poured into her heart, and that a stream of courage and strength was flowing into her from his presence. His presence. Wow. She sat up and looked at him and saw that he was smiling, almost laughing at her. The shame in her eyes met no answering reproach in his. And suddenly she found words echoing in her heart, which other trembling souls had spoken. "My Lord is of very tender compassion to them that are afraid." End quote. As she looked, thankfulness welled up in her heart, and the icy hand of fear, which had clutched her, broke and melted, and joy burst into bloom. A little song rang through like a trickling stream. This is what it was. "My beloved is the chiefest of 10,000 anywhere. He is altogether lovely. He is altogether fair. My beloved is and is strong beyond compare." Much Afraid, the shepherd again. "Tell me what's the matter. Why were you so fearful?" Full of fear, words. "It is the way you have chosen for me to go," she whispered. "It looks so dreadful, shepherd, so impossible. I turn giddy and faint whenever I look at it. The Rose and the Hinds can go there, but they're not limping, crippled, or cowardly like me." "But, Much Afraid, what did I promise you in the valley of humiliation?" asked the shepherd with a smile. Much Afraid looked startled, and the blood rushed into her cheeks and ebbed again, leaving them as white as before. You said, she began and broke off, and then began again. Oh, shepherd, you said you would make my feet like hinds' feet and set me up upon my high places. He answered cheerily, the only way to develop hinds' feet is to go by the paths the hinds use, like this one. In other words, it's not always an easy path. Well, he answered cheerily, you can do it. Much Afraid trembled and looked at him shamefacedly. I don't think I want hinds' feet, if it means I have to go on a path like that. The shepherd was a very surprising person. Instead of looking either disappointed or disapproving, he actually laughed. Oh, yes, you do, he said cheerfully. I know you better than you know yourself, Much Afraid. You want it very much indeed, and I promise you these hinds' feet. Indeed, I have brought you on purpose to this backside of the desert. Excuse me. The backside of the desert. How many times have I heard that come out of my mouth? The backside of the desert, where the mountains are particularly steep and where there are no but the tracks of the deer and of the mountain goats for you to follow. You see, that was going to be her path now. She could follow in their steps. And the promise will be fulfilled. What did I say to you the last time we met? You said, now shalt thou see what I will do, she answered. And then, looking at him reproachfully, added, but I never dreamed you would do anything like this. Lead me to an impassable precipice up which nothing can go but deers and goats, when I'm no more like a deer or a goat than a jellyfish. It's too, she fumbled for words, and then burst out laughing. Why, it's too preposterously absurd. It's crazy. Whatever will you do next? Oh, that cracks me up. The shepherd laughed too. I love doing preposterous things, he replied. Why, I don't know anything more exhilarating and delightful than turning weakness into strength and fear into faith, and that which has been marred into perfection. If there is one thing more than another which I should enjoy doing at this moment, it is turning a jellyfish into a mountain goat. That's my special work, he added with the light of a great joy in his face. Transforming things. To take Much Afraid, for instance, and transform her into... He broke and then went on laughingly. Well, we shall see later on what she finds herself transformed into. It was a really extraordinary scene. In the place where just a little while before, all had been fear and despair. Where the shepherd and Much Afraid, sitting on the rocks at the foot of the impassable precipice, laughing together as though at the greatest joke in the world. Come now, little jellyfish, said the shepherd. Do you believe that I can change you into a mountain goat and get you to the top of the precipice? Yes, replied Much Afraid. Will you let me do it? Yes, she answered. If you want to do such a crazy and preposterous thing, why, certainly you may. Do you believe that I will let you be put to shame on the way up? Much looked at him and then said something that she had never been willing to say before. I don't think I mind so very much if you do. Only have your will and way in me, shepherd. Nothing else matters." As she spoke, something lovely happened. A double rainbow appeared above the precipice, arching it completely, that the zigzag path up which the roe and the doe had gone was framed in the glowing colors. It was such a beautiful and extraordinary sight that Much-Afraid gasped with wonder and delight. But there was something else about it, which was almost more wonderful. She saw that Sorrow and Suffering, who had drawn aside while the shepherd spoke to her, were standing one at either side of the path, and where the ends of the rainbow touched the earth, one touched suffering and the other touched sorrow. Wow. In the shining glory of the rainbow colors, the two veiled figures were so transfigured with beauty that Much-Afraid could only look at them for a moment before being dazzled. Then she did that which only a short time before had seemed utterly impossible. She knelt down at the foot of the precipice and built an altar and laid on it her will, her dread, and her shrinking. And when the fire had fallen, she found among the ashes a larger and rougher-looking stone of the others, sharp-edged and dark in color, but otherwise quite ordinary-looking. This she put in her purse, and then rose to her feet and waited for the shepherd to show her what to do. In her heart, she was hoping that he would accompany her up the dreadful ascent, as he had gone with her down into the desert. But this he did not do. Instead, he led her to the foot of the precipice and said, "Now, Much-Afraid, you have really come to the foot of the high places, and a new stage of the journey is to begin. There are new lessons for you to learn. I must tell you, the precipice to which the path has led you, at the foot of Mount Injury. The whole mountain range stretches a long way beyond this in either direction, and everywhere it is as steep or even steeper as before. There are even more terrible precipices on the sides of Mount Reviling and Mount Hate and Mount Persecution and others besides, but nowhere is it possible to find a way up to the high places and into the kingdom of love without surmounting at least one of them, the one which I have chosen for you to ascend. On the way here, you have been learning the lesson of acceptance with joy, which is the first letter in the alphabet of love. Now you must learn the B of the alphabet of love. You have come to the foot of Mount Injury, and I hope and expect that on up the precipice you will discover what is this next letter of the alphabet, and that you will learn and practice it as you have practiced the A of love. Remember that though you must now meet injury and surmount it, there's nothing on the way up this terrible-looking precipice, nor indeed anything that you may meet above and beyond, that can do you the slightest harm or hurt if you learn and steadfastly practice the second lesson in the ascent of love. When he had said this, his hands upon her with special solemnity and gentleness, and blessed her. Then he called her companions, who immediately stepped forward. Next, he took a rope from a crevice in the wall of the rock, and with his own hands roped together the three who were to ascend the precipice. Wow. Isn't it said that a threefold cord cannot be easily broken? Sorrow was in front, suffering behind, with much afraid in the middle, so that the two who were so strong and sure-footed went before and after. In this way, even if much afraid slipped and fell, they would be able to hold her up and support her with the rope. Lastly, he panned to his side and brought out a little bottle of cordial, which he was much afraid, telling her to drink a little at once and to make use of it if ever she felt giddy or faint on the way. The label on the bread, Spirit of Grace and Comfort. And when much afraid had taken a drop or two, she felt so relieved and revived and strengthened that she was ready to begin the ascent without any feeling of faintness, although there was still a sensation of dread in her heart. By this time the evening was well advanced, but being summer, there were yet 2 or 3 hours before it would begin to be dark. And the shepherd charged them to start at once. For, said he, although you cannot possibly reach the top before nightfall, there is a cave farther up the cliff which you cannot see from here, and there you can rest and spend the night in perfect safety. If you stay down here at the foot of the precipice, your enemies will most certainly steal upon you and seek you harm. However, they will not follow you up this track, and while you're going up, you will be beyond their reach. Though I doubt not, he added, warning, that you will meet them again when you have reached the top. With that, he smiled encouragingly upon them, and immediately Sorrow put her foot upon the first step of the narrow little track which zigzagged up the face of the cliff. Much Afraid followed next, and then Suffering, and in a moment or two they were beginning the ascent. Wow, I read through that, didn't I? So there they are, and now the next chapter is going to be their actual ascent. What questions I had down. When Much Afraid was so hysterical, what did Sorrow and Suffering do to try to help her? They took her by the hand and firmly held on to her and tried to shake some sense into her to call the shepherd, because they knew that was what she needed to do. And what lie did Afraid believe about the shepherd when she thought that she couldn't go any further? She believed that he was really out to get her, and that his will is a terrible thing, and it's to be avoided. And so what was last resort, trying to shake some sense into her, she had that little knife and she pricked her and kind of brought her back to reality. And so then Much Afraid finally cried out to the Lord, to the shepherd. So what do you do when you get in these kind of places and having these kind of feelings and fears? And what are some reasons that you don't cry out to the Lord? I think she was embarrassed, ashamed. I think sometimes we can be embarrassed or ashamed, and that keeps us from calling out to him. Sometimes when we're going through times, we don't want to even be in his presence, but that's actually right where we need to be. So what was the shepherd's response to Much Afraid? Do you remember? He looked at her and spoke to her with no reproach at all. In fact, he was cheerful in that time and spoke cheerily to her. And what are some of the ways you expect him to be like, to react when you're in a mess? Probably, sometimes we can think he's going to act maybe like our parents would have. What does the shepherd remind much afraid? And he reminded her that all his promises up to that point had been true. He had not lied to her. And so that he was not going to start lying to her at this point. How is the promise of Hinds' feet going to become real? Well, she has to go on the path that he chose for her. And it's going to develop her muscles, going to develop her dexterity. She's going to actually develop Hinds' feet in the going. And that's the same with us. And what was the shepherd's response? Much afraid's fear when she wanted to turn back. He reminded her what her heart really wanted. Remember, he said that he knew her better than she knew herself. Even she expected him to be disappointed and disapproving of her. Do you ever see fear that he's going to be disappointed in you or disapproving? Romans 8:1 talks about his grace and mercy and his finished work on the cross. All our sins, past, present, and future, are already taken care of. So it's not about our behavior, not about what you've done. That's already been taken care of by him. So how did Much Afraid think of the whole idea of going up this impossible looking path? She thought he was crazy. Has the Lord ever asked you to do something crazy and absurd? So why does he love to do this kind of thing so much? Because he wants to teach us to walk by faith. Because without faith, it's impossible to please him. That's Hebrews 11:6, Romans 23, and Colossians 2:6 talks about. What was the significance of the talk of the jellyfish? It's because they have no substance. They're like nothing and easily destroyed. So she compared herself to the absolute worst, weakest thing, the jellyfish. You do extremes when you get into hysterics. You think of the worst thing, weakest thing. So what choice does Much Afraid, what did she have to make? She had to believe that he would do what he said, and she had to decide to follow him up the crazy path. So what about being in shame, being put to shame? What does that mean? It could mean that everyone thinks you're wrong or crazy to obey something God's telling you. And it could mean some persecution or abandonment, rejection. Jump to, we think, oh, that's what's going to happen. He's not going to put us to shame. And remember when she said, I don't think it really matters even? She finally came to that point. She wasn't worried about that. When the fear comes through, it no longer has power over us. So she says, okay, so what's next? It can't hurt me. Knowing and following him is what matters more than anything. I had a lot of questions written out this time. So what happened after Much Afraid surrendered finally? The double rainbow came. It appeared. And isn't that something? Sorrow was at one end and suffering was at the other. And they were transformed themselves. Wow. Have you ever had one of those rainbow experiences where you come through something difficult and And then all of a sudden, wow, I see. It's the promise is true. So what was laid down on the altar this time? This is the 6th altar that she has made. And this time she laid down her will, her dread, her shrinking. Yeah. And what were the different precipices through the shepherd that the shepherd was going to take her or tell her to go on? They were the mount of injury, the mount of reviling, the mount of hate, and the mount of persecution. And of those 4, he chose the mount of injury for her. Have you been on any of those mountains? Had to go up them, ascend them? The shepherd decides what mountains we can climb. So how would Much Afraid help herself on the precipice of injury? She's going to practice the 2nd lesson in love. He's teaching her lesson A, lesson B, and she's going to practice love. She's going to bear the cost. What provisions did the shepherd make to help Much Afraid on her? He gave her a rope, right? He braided it, into 3 strands, and he gave her the companions, and he gave her the cordial to drink. So what does this tell us about him in our journey? That he provides us the means to do the impossible. It may seem crazy, but he's going to provide what we need for it. And what did he withhold this time? He went with them in the desert after she made her altar. This time, he is not going with them. He's going to be right there if she needs him, though, if she calls out to him. But his physical presence is not going to be with them. And so how did sorrow and suffering help? Well, they were bound with her in the rope, one before her and one after her, to guide and support her in the climb. So what is grace? It's God's unmerited favor. It's not getting what we deserve, getting what we do not deserve, what we need when we're in a difficult mess. That's grace. What might be a reason that the shepherd said that the relatives wouldn't follow, Much Afraid, on the path up the precipice? It was all she could do. It was all she could bear just to climb up. So he kept them away. They were too cowardly to follow her into these, the precipice of injury. They were cowards. And she would have more strength to resist them after she came to the top. Hallelujah. Well, I think I will end my questions there. And I hope that you enjoyed this chapter. I did. It seems still that every time I read a chapter, I go through something in my life that reminds me of what I've been reading to you. And I'm learning these lessons over again. We can learn them. We can be matured in them. We can be sharpened and ready, and our muscles can be exercised like she's getting exercised, going on the path that he called her to. So I hope the Lord speaks to you during this week of some of the things that were in chapter 9. And I'll just say bye now. And I love you all. God bless you. Bye-bye.